All right. Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to the Future of Our Oceans webinar series brought to you by Oceans at Duke. I'm John Verdon, and I lead Duke's Ocean Policy Research Program at the Nicholas Institute. And it's my pleasure to welcome you all to this webinar today. Now, for those of you that don't know, Oceans at Duke is an interdisciplinary network of faculty and staff from across Duke's campus working on issues of ocean sustainability. Our community of scholars is working together to apply insights from ocean science, governance, and business to tackle some of the ocean's most urgent problems and opportunities as well. So thanks to everybody for joining this monthly webinar series. To date in these series, we've explored a range of topics in ocean sustainability, from the future of marine conservation areas, the role of oceans in human health, marine plastic pollution, coastal ecological restoration in the Anthropocene, and the future and drivers of deep sea mining, among others. And our purpose really with these is to try to highlight the research and latest work of Duke University researchers while also engaging with experts and stakeholders connected to these challenges. And our hope is that these can inform and inspire and really enable you to work with ocean communities and ecosystems so that they flourish for the long term. So today we have a great talk on offshore wind development and wildlife and opportunities to get this right. And so let me just give you first a few quick guidelines for the session. Our session today will be 60 minutes, including our speakers' presentations and a Q&A session in the last 10 minutes. Your cameras and microphones are not functional for this session, but we encourage you to share your questions and comments in the Q&A, which is monitored by our team. And we also encourage you to go to the Oceans at Duke website, where that's linked to your registration. And there you'll see additional information, details, a link to the topic today, faculty research, and also webinar recordings. And today's session is being recorded, and that should be posted to the website later this week. So my pleasure now to introduce you to Doug Nowacek, our first speaker today. Doug is the Randolph K. Repass and Sally Christine Rogers University Distinguished Professor of Conservation Technology and Environment and Engineering at Duke's Nicholas School of the Environment and Pratt School of Engineering, where there his research is focused on marine conservation technology broadly, but specifically the link between acoustic and motor behavior in marine mammals, primarily cetaceans and manatees, and specifically how they use sound in ecological processes. So without further ado, Doug, I'll pass it over to you.
Super. Thanks very much, John. Thanks to all of you for joining us today. We're delighted and lucky to be able to present this webinar to you with some great folks from around the country and around the world, and a little bit of exciting news on the Duke side as we towards the end to describe a new program that's just starting up with us and a host of collaborators. But first, we are delighted to hear from Rachel Asante Owusu, who is a program manager at the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, IUCN, in the Business and Biodiversity program, where she's worked since 2012. The main focus of Rachel's work involves promoting measures to safeguard biodiversity, ecosystem services, natural resource dependent livelihoods, and rights from renewable energy and the extractive sector operations. In addition, Rachel works with companies and countries to support the development and implementation of robust and measurable decarbonization strategies. So thank you, Rachel, and welcome to the Future of Our Oceans.
Thank you so much, and many thanks for the invitation to be able to describe some of IUCN's work today with you all at Duke University. It's much appreciated. So let me just state that I've just come back from the climate change meeting in Glasgow at COP, and one of the clear messages that came out of that meeting was the recognition that if we are to reach the 1.5 degree target that's stipulated in the Paris Agreement, that there's going to have to be an urgent move away from fossil fuel towards cleaner renewable energy, and that this transition is going to happen globally. And there is some good news in terms of how that transition is happening. For instance, last year saw the second largest annual increase in offshore and onshore wind markets, with offshore wind accounting for a record 10% new installations globally. The offshore wind market and the increase in renewable energy is something that we at IUCN see as a real move forward in terms of that transition. But we also recognize that offshore wind related decisions and other renewable energy related decisions do have consequences in the long term, like any infrastructure project. These have lifespans in the decades rather than the years, and that these environmental impacts can happen at both the construction stage in terms of wind projects, the operational stage, and the end of life stage. And the impacts can be around noise, habitat destruction, collision risks, or displacement effects. And when it comes to the transition to renewable energy, IUCN, as I said before, is very much in favor of this, and we're pushing our state members globally and helping our state members to move towards using renewable energy. But we also recognize that we need to learn the lessons that happened from our use of fossil fuel energy, and to make sure that the transition to renewable energy doesn't become a driver for biodiversity loss. And I say this as somebody whose other projects involve issues around oil spill remediation in Nigeria. So to that end, in 2019, IUCN partnered with Électricité de France, Énergie de Portugal, and the Shell Group in order to promote the best available measures that we could find globally to mitigate biodiversity impacts associated with solar and wind power. And for wind power, we looked at both onshore and offshore developments. This work enabled the launch of a few tools, which I'll describe in my presentation today, which specifically targeted the renewable energy sector and the renewable energy operators. The work was carried out jointly with a consultancy company called the Biodiversity Consultancy, and it involved numerous IUCN NGO members, including BirdLife International, Fauna and Flora International, the Wildlife Conservation Society, and the Nature Conservancy. So I'm gonna talk now about some of the outputs that came from this work from 2019 to 2021. One of the main outputs was a guidance which looked at how best to mitigate the biodiversity impacts from or associated with solar and wind energy. And these guidelines were aimed at supporting all actors to manage their biodiversity risks associated with these renewable energy projects. And the recommendations in the guidelines spoke to the whole project life cycle, from early planning through to decommissioning and repowering. And I should say that all the work that I mentioned in this presentation is available online. So I'm just going to go through some of the key elements that came out of the report, the key elements around best practice in the renewable energy sector to mitigate impacts on biodiversity. One of the first key issues that we dealt with was around early risk screening. And this was seen by the experts to be crucial in view of the fact that we felt that operators need to know the environment that they're working in, need to know the biodiversity and habitat composition of the environment they're working in. This knowledge will then help them make decisions, mitigation decisions later on in the line. And in fact, the sensitivity mapping and early risk screening was seen as being so important that we actually developed a separate shorter guidance for that. And I'll describe that later in the presentation. Another key element of best practice that was identified was the need to implement a mitigation hierarchy approach to renewable energy projects. And the mitigation hierarchy is an approach that calls for operators, first of all, to identify and quantify their impacts on biodiversity, and then look at how they can avoid impacts on biodiversity. For those impacts that can't be avoided, we then look at ways that these impacts can be mitigated. And then for those impacts that can't be mitigated, we then look at ways that we can restore the impacts that have happened to biodiversity. And then we finally have what we call residual impacts. These are impacts that can't be avoided, can't be minimized, and can't be restored. And for those impacts, what we call for is a compensation or an offset to compensate for the residual impact to the level at which the operation can say it's had a no net loss, or ideally a net gain impact when measuring its whole impact globally. So we do call for a mitigation hierarchy approach to be implemented, and we also recognize that operations need to constantly be measuring their impacts to see if they're on course towards meeting their targets of either no net loss or net gain. In addition, we ask for operators to have a landscape, or in this case, seascape approach to the work they're doing. A lot of offshore renewable energy installations are usually happening in multifunctional habitats. So there may be fisheries happening in the same habitat. There may be conservation zones in that habitat. It's about learning to work with other activities that are happening within your landscape or seascape. We also ask that operators look at the consideration of both their indirect and direct impacts. So indirect impacts are impacts that happen as a consequence of the operation, but may not happen by first-hand actions of the particular operation. And also we ask them to look at cumulative impacts. This is to look at what's happening by other actors in the landscape and how your maybe minimal impact may be being echoed and may grow into being quite a significant impact when added on to the impacts happening from different operators within your landscape. I've already mentioned about no net loss and net gain targets for biodiversity. What we recommend in the guidance is that these targets are set for at least key biodiversity features, if not all biodiversity features. So there's a minimum requirement in the guidance. And I've already spoken about the need to offset and the need to have mitigation actions around your impacts that can't be avoided. And finally, and probably most importantly, there needs to be a robust monitoring system that looks at the impacts on biodiversity, an adaptive management approach that changes and learns lessons from the experience of operating in a particular landscape or seascape. So we've looked at this, and I've gone through the key elements. Sorry, that's the same slide. So I'll just move on to the next slide. As I mentioned previously, the focus on early risk screening was seen as being crucial in the work that we did with the renewable sector phase 1. And it was seen to be so important that we actually developed specific guidance for industry, looking at tools that already exist to help operators develop and monitor and design their operations by looking at the biodiversity that is already there in their landscape. So we looked at tools like IBAT and other screening tools that really help operators to have a firm idea of if they're operating in areas of high biodiversity and which areas they really should avoid, and areas where it's probably a more ideal location for having renewable energy infrastructure. So we looked at that for both offshore wind, onshore wind, and solar, and developed specific targeted guidance around early screening for biodiversity risks. Now I'm going to go on to talk about what we're planning to do in the phase 2 element of the IUCN work with the renewables sector. In phase 2, we're going to shift our focus a little bit away from renewable energy operators and more towards regulators and state actors. And this is something that is quite intuitive for IUCN, because along with having NGO members, we also have state members. So we'll be looking at helping regulators to really plan and site renewable energy infrastructure and operations in areas that will have lower risks for biodiversity. And this work is really aimed at pushing towards an equitable transition and sharing of lessons learned around the renewable energy sector. So what we're looking at doing is creating a safe platform where renewable energy operators and governments and NGOs can come together and talk about lessons learned around spatial planning and cumulative impacts, and also identify and develop some guidance around that. And some of the priority areas that we'll be looking at is the need to promote and assess early on the cumulative impacts of renewable energy developments. Again, looking at how renewable energy developments can work in multifunctional areas, and also looking at helping governments to really understand what are the benefits of strategic impact assessments, and planning way in the future what functionality is going to happen around different landscapes. We'll also look around stakeholder consent. This has been a real issue, and there are globally there are different aspects of it depending on whether we're talking to our members in Europe or whether we're talking to our members in Africa or South America. So really trying to look at how we can foster better stakeholder engagement that really listens to local communities. And again, we'll be working with our different NGOs and indigenous peoples groups to really help us get a handle on best practice around stakeholder consent. As always with most IUCN initiatives, we'll be looking to promote concepts and tools and to identify, really help identify suitable areas for renewable energy infrastructure and development. And this is really around trying to avoid, again, areas of high biodiversity, learning from the lessons from the fossil fuel age, where we tended to have a lot of projects around World Heritage sites and crucially important biodiversity areas, trying to move the renewable energy development away from those areas and into areas where there's less high biodiversity to be impacted by these developments. Finally, another element of work that we'll be looking at is around trying to promote the demand for more responsibly sourced and produced raw materials. And this will be around looking at how to help the renewable energy sector to really promote responsible sourcing and to ensure that greener, cleaner energy in one area of the globe hasn't come from biodiversity and environmental destruction at the other end of the globe, and really making sure that value chains are sustainable all the way along and not just at one end or another. So like phase one, our phase two work will involve many actors, as I mentioned before, from the renewable energy providers to IUCN's NGO members, IUCN's community and indigenous peoples members, our state members and regulators, and the financial sector. And what I would encourage is that anybody who's interested in participating in this would please feel free to get in touch, because we really do try and have an inclusive and collaborative approach to the work that we do. And we aim to be as transparent as possible as we move forward. For more details on the tools that I've touched on in this presentation, we have some videos to watch. There are technical videos around specific aspects of mitigation actions on offshore, and technical videos around solar operations as well, so that they're given in a much more eloquent manner than I've given today. But there are lots of videos and webinars and tools that are available both on YouTube and also on the IUCN website as well. So with that, I will say thank you for the opportunity to speak to everybody today. And as I've said before, if you're interested in contributing, please feel free to get in touch. Thank you very much, Doug.
Yeah, Rachel, thank you. Thank you for that perspective and for joining us in the evening in Switzerland. The IUCN input is always important and welcomed. Great. I did want to, Julia Carbone was also on the schedule for today. She has fallen ill, not too ill, I understand, but was unable to join us. So we'll move on to our next speaker, Chris Olath, who delighted to have her with us. And Chris has worked in the offshore wind industry for nearly 20 years, since really the days of its inception in the US, holding senior positions with offshore wind developers, NGOs, and state agencies. She has gained critical insights into the policy and regulations that shape offshore wind activities at the state, regional, and federal levels. Kate has extensive experience working with offshore wind stakeholders and has expert knowledge of such engagements, having worked with an offshore wind and ocean policy issues at all levels from industry, state, and NGO perspectives. In her current role as the director of the Special Initiative on Offshore Wind, she leads the organization on to develop strategies to support the responsible and sustainable development of the offshore wind industry in the US. With that, thanks, Chris, for joining us, and it's all yours.
Thanks so much, Doug, and really appreciate the opportunity to address your audience. I know you have quite an esteemed group, so certainly appreciate the opportunity, and really such a great, I think, lead in with Rachel's comments and her presentation before this, to kind of talk about what the global perspective is on the importance of wildlife as offshore wind technology grows and accelerates around the globe. I'm going to take it a little closer to home for us here in the US and talk about where we are with respect to US offshore wind, and then focus in on some of the work I've been doing just in my career, and also with the special initiative regarding engagement with stakeholders And I think there is a strong nexus with wildlife with respect to those issues. So just have about a dozen slides to share with you all, and looking forward to getting into the questions and answers and discussion. So please do tee up those questions. I just want to take one moment, because I know we're not as famous as IUCN, to talk about SIOW. We're an organization who relies on fact-based research and multi-sectoral collaboration to provide an expertise, analysis, and information sharing, and really to help develop strategic solutions to advance the responsible and sustainable development of offshore wind in the United States. We are guided by a steering committee of diverse interests, and essentially are a think tank where we are generating support for policymakers who need support in the elements of offshore wind in the US, often working with and for federal and state agencies. We are not a trade organization, and we're funded by private foundations. This helps support our objectivity and the unique approach that we have to our work at the SIOW. So in case you're not familiar, I just want to do a little level setting with respect to where we are in the US and where we're headed. For the first time in our nation, we have a nation stated and a nationwide offshore wind goal, and that is to develop 30 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2030. On the slide in front of you, put together, and this comes from the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, a map that shows all of the lease areas that have either been already leased and auctioned to developers for building offshore wind, or ones that are under consideration in the different stages of development, and eventually will likely be leased as through the federal auction process. And so just to give you a bit of a primer, all of these lease areas are located in what is known as federal waters, so more than 3 miles from the coast. And so once you go beyond 3 miles, those are federal waters controlled by the Department of Interior's Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, or BOEM. So they are the ones who are leasing these areas, and they're all in different stages of development. So that 30 gigawatt target that we have by 2030 would be supported by the lease areas that are pictured here and are in different phases of development. Currently operating, we have 42 megawatts of offshore wind. So that is quite a way to go in the next essentially 8 years at this point. We have the Block Island Wind Farm, which is off the coast of Block Island, Rhode Island, which is 5 6-megawatt turbines, so 30 gigawatts of wind power there. And then the Coastal Virginia project, which is another 12 megawatts, 2 turbines. Both of these are demonstration scale projects. So we have no commercial scale, utility scale offshore wind operating in the US at this time. Kind of what's up next on, the next projects that will likely be built would be the Vineyard Wind 1 project, which is an 800 megawatt project, which I think technically broke ground last week with some onshore construction. However, there are 4 lawsuits that are currently pending and active against that project. So we'll circle around to the stakeholder issue, but that certainly will, I think is a little distracting right now for the industry and that project. So, things we want to think about as we're engaging with stakeholders. And then next up beyond that would be the South Fork Wind project, considerably smaller at 132 megawatts, pretty far offshore, 35 miles due east of Montauk, New York. And I think I'm not great at math, that's why I went to school for journalism, but if you add all of those up that are kind of next in queue, in addition to the ones we have, we still aren't reaching 1 gigawatt. It's still under 1,000 megawatts of power. So we do have a long way to go. And I want to talk a little bit about now, really some of the opportunities and challenges that are presented that, are either supporting the development of offshore wind or really providing some real consternation at the time in the sector. The main opportunities are the economic development opportunities in bringing an entirely new industry to the U.S. and strong influence on these coastal communities who may have been left behind as economic development and manufacturing have moved away from port and coastal towns over the past decades. So really strong economic development opportunities. The environmental benefits are very strong from offshore wind, certainly in reducing the emissions and particulate matter in our air that we breathe, from reducing all of the environmental issues throughout the entire supply chain of fossil fuel development and fossil fuel energy, even if it's in the transportation of fuel. There are many different phases of bringing energy to the grid. And even if you think about the transportation of fuel, there are no pipelines needed, for example. There's no shipping needed. The fuel is where the project is. It's wind. Wind is the fuel for offshore wind energy. So just in that one slice of bringing offshore wind to the grid, we see that certain drop in impact. Climate change mitigation, for sure. I really appreciated Rachel's comments about the attention at COP26 to offshore wind as really being a key piece in a clean energy economy and a clean energy future for our planet. Right now, and particularly in the United States, this is the only commercially scaled technology that is available for deployment currently at a commercial scale. Just excuse me, I have a frog in my throat. 1 second, sorry. Hopefully someone can cut that out of the recording. But anyhow, so that's really, it's really the only commercial scale technology we have available right now. So there's questions about tidal energy, for example, and even floating offshore wind, which will be deployed on the west coast of the US. These technologies are all great, and I think they're all needed. However, they're not available at full scale commercial deployment right now. All making strides, but not available right now. And certainly a reliable energy supply offshore wind can bring, because what we're seeing, especially in the US energy markets, is that power plants are coming offline, right? All these nuclear power plants that have been phased out over time, those are not being repowered. We are not going to likely be siting any type of new fossil fuel generation. But at the same time, we're talking about electrification of nearly everything, of our buildings, of our cars, of our commercial fleets for transportation. So if we're going to continue to focus on electrification, then it's more important than ever that we have a clean supply for bringing that electricity to market and not doing it with fossil fuels. Again, there are major challenges with offshore wind. Interconnection alone, bringing these 30 gigawatts of offshore wind, essentially injecting power into coastal grids, is a real technical challenge, and one that's being grappled with by many in the industry. And if you think about it, power traditionally is generated and then delivered out to the coasts on, these kind of capillaries in the energy system, if you will. So energy would be generated. So I'm in the New York metro area. So most of our electricity is generated Pennsylvania, Ohio, western parts of New Jersey. And then as the power transmits out to the coast, the power lines get smaller and smaller and smaller until it's that one little line that's on a utility pole running out to the beach. And so the idea that now we're going to turn that system on its head, generate huge amounts of electricity in the ocean and deliver it from east to west, in the case of the New York metro area, there's a lot of new challenges that present itself. The grid was never designed for that. So in and of itself, that is a huge issue. We see supply chain constraints, whether that's no existing vessels that are Jones Act compliant, that can build these large foundations and turbines out at sea. We see constraints in not having, a US-based supply chain yet, because we don't have an industry here. So there are a variety of supply chain constraints, from ports and vessels to turbine supply to foundations. And then my personal favorite are the challenges regarding the stakeholders. And I do want to make sure we get to that. So I might just skip quickly through another couple slides and make sure we have time for our discussion. I do want to point out that at the Special Initiative on Offshore Wind, we recently published a report that essentially describes the large opportunity, $109 billion in revenue opportunity for the supply chain in building this 30 gigawatts of offshore wind. This is one of, if not the largest, private sector revenue opportunity and injection into our economy available. And what's exciting is that with the infrastructure package and hopefully with Build Back Better passing soon, this will be coupled with public sector investments to our infrastructure and really create this synergy of investment and development that is super exciting for not only our environment, but for our economy. On the screen now, you can see how the pipeline of offshore wind is continuing to grow, really led by state targets. Across the bottom of the screen, you can see the bars that indicate states and what their targets are doing. And really, it's been the states leading these efforts, setting renewable portfolio standards, and then, having their state-based targets, because eventually what happens is once the developers build the wind farm, they are selling it to the state to meet their renewable portfolio standards or whatever other type of clean energy standards they have in the states. So the states are driving this. And if you want a full copy of this and other really interesting slides about offshore wind and those charts, you can visit offshorewindpower.org and get a full copy of this report. Falling costs of offshore wind, I think, are also something that's really ramping up and accelerating the development of offshore wind, not only in the US, but around the world. The red stars on the chart in front of you indicate the cost per megawatt hour of offshore wind projects in the US, and you can see this precipitous drop. In fact, the cost of offshore wind has fallen more than 60% in Europe over the past 5 years alone. And so the way Rachel is describing the environmental and climate imperative, along with this confluence of costs falling, and meanwhile, natural gas and other market forces in the US and abroad really pushing up the cost of fossil fuels, it really seems that offshore wind is having its moment after decades of waiting in the US for nearly 30 years now. Really, the costs of offshore wind are falling because of technology advancements and supply chain advancements that we've seen globally that are coming to rest here in the US. I want to pivot and talk a little bit about the offshore wind stakeholders. And for me, what I'm most passionate about, because we know that offshore wind can be built. We appreciate that it's important that it's done in concert with wildlife conservation. We know that offshore wind can be purchased. We know how to finance these projects. We've been doing it worldwide for more than 30 years with nearly 6,000 turbines spinning around the globe in the ocean. But one thing in the US that we have as a particular challenge is the ability to bring folks together with a sense of one shared societal goal or societal benefit. And as many of you know, this certainly extends beyond offshore wind. In a more and more polarized culture and society, stakeholders are being more vocal about concerns with offshore wind. And on the slide in front of you, I've listed just a sampling of the different stakeholders who are involved and interested in offshore wind. So we have certainly existing ocean users like recreation and commercial fishermen. We have folks who are concerned about rates going up. We have elected officials. We have the tribes, labor and business communities, coastal communities, those folks who actually live at the beaches. We have the NGOs, regulators, maritime and shipping. We have just a whole slew of folks. My mother, for example, is an offshore wind stakeholder, right? She's someone who goes to the beach and she's really interested in seeing what happens with offshore wind. So there's really very many stakeholders to communicate with And some of the questions I have in my role are around who is it that should be doing this communication? Offshore wind developers certainly are central to this, but what is the role of regulators? What is the role of the NGOs? What is the role of us as everyday citizens? I know that it is my goal every day to tell someone new about offshore wind. So if you're lucky enough to be standing next to me at the grocery store, I may just say, hey, I'll keep my 6 feet distance, but have you heard about that new awesome project that just got permitted off the coast of New York called South Fork Wind? So for me, it's incumbent upon all of us to help offshore wind become more mainstream in the US, because I know the many of you who have joined us today know about offshore wind, but for many folks in pop culture, it's still a bit of like science fiction. And I think bringing it to the fore is an important part of stakeholder engagement. The most prominent stakeholder concerns, and these aren't necessarily in a particular order, but they relate to the viewshed and folks who are concerned about seeing turbines from their beaches and from their homes at the beach. Other local impacts at landfall locations, for example, concerns about electromagnetic fields. Impacts to existing ocean users. We certainly see the fishing community having many concerns about offshore wind, the environmental issues, whether that's marine mammals during construction, the environmental justice community, and certainly avian impacts, which I think we have not yet ruled out and still need to pay close attention to. And then finally, costs. So these are the 5 buckets that I personally see the most concerns around offshore wind from stakeholders. And really, stakeholders do have a very powerful impact, because the first 3 projects that are listed on this slide, they never made it. This is what I call the tombstone slide. The Long Island project, Blue Water Wind off the coast of Delaware, Cape Wind off the coast of Massachusetts, and even the Block Island wind farm was stalled for over a year because of local concerns at the Rhode Island coastal areas. So really, if we want to see the 30 gigawatt target come to fruition and this clean energy brought to bear for our environment and the economy, we need to be bringing our stakeholders along with us. And I look forward to having a conversation with you all about the best ways to maybe do that. My cell phone number is up on the screen, so please take that down. Feel free to contact me anytime. And to get a copy of that report, you can visit offshorewindpower.org.
Super duper, Chris. Thank you so much. A really cool run through what's happening in the U.S. and obviously the important stakeholders that are involved in the issue. Now it's my pleasure and privilege to give you a quick background, a quick intro, I should say, to a new project that we have focused here at Duke. Just leading it here at Duke, we have quite a few collaborators, but to continue in the progression, this one is focused almost exclusively on wildlife and as it pertains to offshore wind development. So I'm just going to run through these, and I'm planning to leave quite a good bit of time for question and answer. So I'll just get started. The Wildlife and Offshore Wind project, affectionately known as Project WOW, and you have to say it that way when you refer to it. So it was an easy acronym to come up with, but this was well, I'll just get going. So the funding comes from the U.S. Department of Energy and the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, and I should say that this is brand new, just announced about a month ago, and we are still in sort of pre-award negotiations and so on with Department of Energy. So, but we're looking to have a start date of the 1st of January 2022. I'll move on to the collaborators. It's quite a diverse and skilled team that I'm honored to be able to lead, with several folks at Duke with me. But then, as you can see on here, there's quite a lot of collaborators from all over the country and all over the world in expertise in acoustics, in birds and bats, in statistical modeling, and running the gamut. So the project is focused on birds, bats, and marine mammals. We do have a small component with sea turtles, just to try to keep them as part of the discussion and do some identification of what their needs are with respect to this enterprise. Next, we also have we have a wonderful group of that's on the advisory board for Project WOW, and this actually came along as part of the proposal. We worked with some of the developers that you see there on the screen to support primarily helping us to think about how best to integrate wildlife sampling and surveying with the efforts that are going on at the various sites. The other thing is that these developers have agreed to share data that they have or have sponsored in regards to wildlife sampling, so we can bring it into the fold of trying to understand the potential impacts. And we also have another important member is the regional wildlife science entity up in the top right. This is a group that was just formed and has very complementary goals and missions to what we're trying to do. So there's a great community developing around this issue, and we're all trying to keep rowing in the same direction. And I see Project WOW as really a force multiplier in helping to keep this enterprise on the right track. So just quickly on the goals, our goal is to create a systems approach for evaluating potential effects of offshore wind, again, specifically on birds, bats, and marine mammals, but also at a range of temporal and spatial scales. Is it happening right at the level of pile driving for the wind turbines? Is it happening on a larger scale? How we're going to do that is to provide frameworks, which I'll get to in just a moment, and also some data gap identification and paradigms for efficient and effective assessment of the potential effects. We certainly understand and will fold in as much as possible the lessons learned in the European development of offshore wind. There are also some lessons out of China, but the lessons out of the European theater are numerous and important, and we have some good ties already with some European projects that are similar to ours, so that we can develop those synergies as well. At the end, we want to share those open source systems with the Department of Energy and developers and other stakeholders to continue to facilitate responsible development of offshore wind even after Project WOW has concluded. Okay, so just quickly on the frameworks, this was part of our idea, and in working down these three different types of frameworks, what we see is you need more information as you go down, and this can be based on a species or an area or some kind of exposure. And then as we go down the list, we need more and more information about demography, about impacts on individuals, impacts on things like vital rates, and I'll get to those. But what that also brings us is a greater ability for predictive capability for understanding those impacts. Just to run over those, so this is an example of data that we could feed in. This is data existing already, and so there's quite good data channels, and one of our jobs is to help standardize those and help keep those open and flowing. But this is seabirds and marine mammals in a couple of the areas. You'll notice, you'll see what Chris showed, some of these areas for development off the US East Coast, and we see annual or seasonal variation in the occurrence of various species. So this is the kind of data that we want to take in and build into those frameworks. The more detailed frameworks, something slightly more quantitative, is a risk matrix where we look at vulnerability and some kind of exposure index, and then we're able to say sort of low, medium, high, very high kinds of potential impact. Then to get to this next one, which is the population consequences of some kind of disturbance, requires quite a lot of data. As you can see, data on vital rates of individual animals and species. As we get some exposure to a stressor and either some physiological change or behavioral change, that we can then cascade down to query, to ask the question about whether this stressor could cause a significant impact. Okay, so the workflow that we envision for WOW is that we'll do the first period of it is this data synthesis and aggregation and constructing those frameworks. Then those will be used to inform that middle panel, which is the integrated regional ecosystem studies. And I have a quick slide on that in a minute. And then we take the data from those monitoring and survey studies and bring that back into the statistics and modeling framework to understand the potential for the potential impacts from those. So as Rachel said, the importance of monitoring and adaptive management, we're not into the adaptive management side of things, but certainly the monitoring and aggregating data is really one of the big things that we are going to work on. So on these integrated systems, just on the left there is just an example of a power analysis that we did. And it's a very important part of how to do this, because there's not unlimited resources to go out and monitor every square inch, every square mile of ocean as these projects develop. We need to do these things in a targeted fashion. And so developing things like a power analysis, how many surveys do we need in a particular area to really understand whether or not there is an impact. And this goes by species and area, and there's lots of variables that go into it, but it's an important part of the puzzle. On the right there, we see some sampling done by our colleagues at Rutgers, and you see an ocean glider going out and measuring temperature. You see the track of the glider, and those two little white dots in the lower left-hand corner are detections of right whales, North Atlantic right whales, on the glider acoustic system. And so what we're doing there is really overlaying those sighting locations with an oceanographic front, which again is another component of understanding and sampling the environment and the potential for impacts of any activities, but in this case, offshore wind. So what I envision this as is really as a circle in terms of understanding and informing the various components of this. And so again, the WOW project is really slotted as a force multiplier and trying to understand and help these various components continue on, inject where we can. We certainly cannot do all the sampling the integrated regional studies are very targeted in terms of their location, and will be integrated with the developers in terms of sampling around the time that they're actually doing activities is one strategy. So we can really pinpoint some of those effects. And this is the timeline. So we actually won't get started until the beginning of 2022. We have a couple of switchovers along the way after we do that data aggregation and framework construction in the first period, and then a couple of years of sampling, and then bring it to a close and offload and make all those tools available to folks to continue that good work. Okay, that's about all the time I have. We'll leave some time for question and answer. The first thing that I would like to do is to thank all of you for attending. Thank the speakers and watch for developments in Project WOW, and please visit the other websites that you heard about from our other speakers. And next is to ask my colleague Dan Vermeer to launch a poll. If you wouldn't mind just taking a quick poll, we can keep track of and get a sampling of who's attending as we develop different topics for the Future of Our Oceans webinar. It helps us to understand who our audience really is. So if you could take that poll, and then I will turn it over to another colleague, Rebecca Vidra, who is who's going to moderate our question and answer session for today. Thank you, Rebecca.
Thank you, Doug. And Project WOW kind of touches on some of the questions that are coming up in the Q&A box and in the chat. So thanks all for the questions. And this one might be good to bring Rachel back in to talk about these wind farms really as ecosystems. So Andrew is asking about mitigation measures to reduce bird strikes, which I think any of us who have thought about wind think about birds. So that's an interesting question, but also to maybe not just think about mitigating potential bird strikes, but thinking about the wind farm itself as an ecosystem and maybe some of the services that it may actually provide. So just wondering if you could talk a little bit about that.
So I think it's entirely possible that some wind farms could become ecosystems, and I say that from the lessons that we've learned from oil rigs and the fact that having these no fishing and no entry zones around oil rigs has really helped these structures become artificial reefs sometimes. And so I think it's not, I should say, it's not always negative the impacts that that offshore structures can have, and it's important that we look at both the potential positive and the potential negative impacts on biodiversity. But when we talk about birds, the other thing that I would like to add is that we need to also look at the story with migratory birds, and to look at not only where the wind farms are in the US, but maybe also where the wind farms are in different parts of the world as well, because that will also have an effect on birds.
Do either of the other panelists have something to add to that? Okay.
I don't think so. I think the only thing I would add is there is good overlap actually in the species composition of birds that have been the subject of study in Europe. So it's a little tougher on the mammal side. Just to plug that in quickly, most of the concern in European waters has been for smaller cetaceans, smaller whales and dolphins inshore, and the slightly different take to that is in the US. It's baleen whales, the large whales off the coast, but the bird species overlap is actually quite helpful in terms of informing our efforts in the US.
Great, thank you. And now a policy question. Let's get it done 30 by 2030 question for Chris and for others too. So I'll combine a couple of the questions. So we have one around the need to rapidly decarbonize our electricity generation. And so how do you sort of centralize the currently fragmented US regulatory system? And then another question about partnering with other companies. So what is the way forward? Is it to do all of these little projects, you know, where we can? Is there any way to sort of coordinate and address some of the stakeholder impacts that you were discussing earlier, Chris?
Well, I don't think I've ever heard a better analogy for offshore wind than kind of that one about building the plane while you're flying it, in terms of getting to that 30 gigawatt target. You know, it's not that we don't know how to build offshore wind, but there's so many parties and factors involved with it, and the establishment of it, something that frankly we've been neglecting for decades here in the US. And so now it's kind of go time, and we're in a bit of a scramble around some of these issues. I do think that BOEM, our federal regulator on this, plays such a key role, and they are doing everything they can and have such great talented staff. They have great line items in the new budget to ramp up their staff indeed, because they have a huge backlog to deal with after the previous administration in terms of permitting. Using them in their role as the lead agency under NEPA, I think really is the most effective and efficient way to move forward while also honoring the existing environmental regulations. It's just that it hasn't yet happened. And so it's kind of getting those gears greased up and ready to move. So that's taking a little bit of time. And, you know, it's, you know, that proverb about, you know, you can go fast alone or go far together. Right. And so we're trying to get really far. And so it takes more time than I think we want to, but I think that will really show progress in getting to 2030. And on the other question regarding what we're doing to either have joint ventures or ways we can use existing acumen and experience in all those companies that have been building these 6,000 turbines around the world so far, those same companies are the ones that are building offshore wind in the US. So the company, for example, with the largest portfolio for US offshore wind is Ørsted. They are the largest offshore wind developer in the world, and we're very fortunate to have them here in the US market, very responsible player. Other oil and gas majors are coming into the market like Shell, Exxon, and others. So it's really exciting to see those companies making a green transition. And also they are the ones who have experience building in the marine environment. We're seeing the experience of US oil and gas as well. So there really is strong expertise and experience around it already.
Great, thank you. Well, it's 1:30. We do have some other questions in the chat that we'll try to pull some answers together for. So thank you for a really inspiring conversation. I'm going to turn it over to Dan to close us out.
All right. Well, thanks, Rebecca, and thanks to Doug and Chris Rachel, the speakers today. Fantastic discussion, I think, on a really exciting area that's got enormous potential. And I think it's really helpful for us to really think deeply about both the potential and the risk and what it's going to take to do this right so that it becomes a really critical part of our infrastructure and our ways of addressing climate change long term. I want to thank all of the attendees on the webinar today. Really great attendance, and I encourage you all to continue to be part of our Oceans at Duke community, our webinars that we offer on a monthly basis. The next one will be John Verdon and Javier Bezerto, who will be speaking about the role of small-scale fisheries in addressing the issues of society. The talk is labeled Hidden Harvests, because this is a really critical part of the ocean economy that is often overlooked. We're going to continue to do these webinars and increase the kind of range of stakeholders that we want to bring into these conversations. What we've seen is just a great kind of convergence of the public sector, academics, nonprofits, and people who are actually in the industries of building these systems. And so we're really excited to bring that kind of cross section of players together. We hope that you'll continue to be part of these conversations. Also would like to just put on your radar that we'll be holding the Blue Economy Summit at Duke, the first inaugural Blue Economy Summit on March 18 and 19. You can go to the Oceans at Duke website to find out more information about both past and upcoming webinars and about the summit. And we thank you for your attendance and your attention, and we look forward to seeing all of you again in our future events. Thanks for joining us, and see you soon.